Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this forum kajian pembangunan public webinar titled The Impact of Coffee Sustainability Certification on Smallholders. My name is Nabila Huwaida and I'm from JPAL Southeast Asia. Today, we are very glad to be joined by Russell Toth from the University of Sydney. And today he will be sharing with us his research with Professor Busanul Arifin and Jeff Nielsen about the impact of coffee certification program in Lampung, Sumatra. The presentation will be about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session after that. If throughout the presentation, any of the audience have a quick question or any point that you would like to be clarified on the spot, please feel free to leave a comment on the Q&A box. Otherwise, for questions that would require a longer discussion, we will reserve them for the Q&A session. Okay, so without further ado, I will give the floor to Russell Toth to start the presentation. Russell, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Great, thank you. Can everyone see my slides? Yes, great. Okay, so thanks so much. It's really exciting to be presenting this in FKP, and I really look forward to the discussion. So this has been a long-term project with lots of different partners and lots of exciting developments along the way. So there's a number of partners listed here, including our colleagues at JPAL, which is situated with an LPEM at UE. We work with SurveyMeter for a lot of the survey data collection, and then there's the partner universities that were involved in the study. And we also thank our funders for their funding support. Initially, the ACR. The IC Alliance through the Ford Foundation, and also DFAT for additional funding. Okay, so today's talk is about coffee, and specifically interventions that try to encourage smallholder farmers to produce more sustainably. So let's start by talking a little bit about coffee and where these programs came from. So today, more than half of global coffee production originates from farms or plantations that follow some form of certification or verification standard. So the vast majority of coffee and many of these kind of crops is produced in the tropics in countries like Indonesia. The focus on trying to make production of these agricultural crops more sustainable emerged really strongly in the 1990s. There was kind of two trends there. One was that there was increasing concerns about damage to the tropical environment, and an awareness of the need to protect the tropical environment, and that smallholder farmers in many countries can play an important role in slash and burn and other agriculture techniques. And then there was also a concern about price declines in coffee, and particularly how that would impact low-income households that are dependent on coffee for their livelihood. So there was broad movements that led to a number of different trends and programs emerging. So the largest one has definitely been these certification programs.
Recording in progress.
Aim to improve the productive, social, and/or environmental practices of producers, and can also function as a form of corporate social responsibility for the big coffee buyers around the world, the exporters, the roasters, etc. So there's various kinds of schemes. You might be familiar with these. You might have seen them when you buy bagged coffee or roasted coffee or on a coffee cup. Or other coffee products. So I'll kind of put them into three bins. So the first two bins are third-party schemes. So there's some kind of external organization that's certifying the validity of the production in some way. So I'll say, one set of schemes is third-party limited focus schemes like fair trade, That's quite a famous one. It's very focused on setting price floors, so minimum prices, attempting to protect lower income farmers. There's also specialist labels like certified organic production. The bulk of production is in the third-party sustainability certification and verification schemes, which will be our focus today. So example, nonprofit, non-government kind of organizations. So some of the corporate players like Starbucks have said, hey, we could run our own internal scheme, and created their own internal certification schemes. So that's just a broad overview. Today, we're going to focus on this middle bin, so third-party sustainability certification and verification. And within the third-party schemes, the sustainability and verification programs represented 84% of third-party schemes as of 2016. So what do these schemes involve? So unlike fair trade, they typically don't involve setting a price floor. Rather, they try to provide more carrots to encourage farmers to better production practices. So typically, farmers receive training in good agricultural practices across a number of dimensions. Typically, their kind of compliance with the scheme is verified by an independent auditor, usually annually. So they'll usually the farmers are clustered together in groups, and the auditor will come and randomly select a small number of farmers in the group each year and visit their farm and check that they're following the practices, or attempt to check. One incentive that farmers get is they get, if they're part of a group that's certified, they typically get a small premium. This is usually 1% to 5% of the price per kilo of coffee. And then they can get also additional support. So usually being part of a scheme, especially if it's being led by a buyer or an exporter, typically that leads the farmers to have a relationship with that exporter, and it might lead to other benefits like access to inputs, could be fertilizer, pesticide, safe pesticides, could be equipment, other things. So in the smallholder context, that especially where we're focused, certification is often paid for by the buyer or the exporter, not the farmers themselves. So you could also see this as kind of a form of CSR or a development intervention, but also a way for the exporters to influence the farmers that they're sourcing from. And so these are the schemes that we're going to focus on in this talk. 4C, which is kind of the word verification is really attached to 4C. 4C was designed as kind of a minimal or baseline standard that kind of a lot of different stakeholders could agree upon. And then Rainforest Alliance is seen as a more kind of specialized standard. It has a lot more criteria than 4C does. So in this research project, we evaluate the impacts of sustainability certification and verification programs, working with smallholder farmers in a remote part of South Sumatra province in Indonesia. So we evaluate both 4C and Rainforest Alliance in this context over a 5-year period. So we want to ask, kind of the basic questions. Do the schemes they are trying to do they, lead the farmers to change their behavior, on their coffee farm? Does that lead to improvements in their economic, social, and environmental outcomes on the farm and for their household more broadly? And what are the broader effects on households, communities, markets, et cetera? To our knowledge, our study on Rainforest Alliance is the first randomized controlled trial in the context of sustainability standards. And we also use a quasi-experimental design to study the impacts of 4C. And I'll talk more, in the coming slides about how we do that. But this is broadly what we're doing is evaluating these two standards in the same setting, so the same area of Indonesia, and both studies were kind of going on in parallel. In terms of existing literature, there's a really large mixed methods literature that tries to look at the effects of certification schemes for smallholder agriculture, including coffee. So work has been done around the world, and Southeast Asia, in South America, in Africa, et cetera. However, the quantitative studies in this literature tend to rely on cross-sectional data from smaller samples, and studies that actually use methods like randomized control trial are very rare or almost non-existent. The studies that do use kind of more rigorous techniques to identify causal effects tend to be focused on higher value coffee on large estates in Central and South America. So there's been quite a few studies on fair trade. Here's a list, and there's others. But as I mentioned earlier, fair trade is actually represents a fraction of the coffee production relative to what's produced through under certification and verification schemes. And there's just, not a lot of literature that uses more kind of rigorous causal identification techniques in the context of non-specialty smallholder dominant coffee production, where, you really have mixed livelihoods and it's less clear what the effects of these standards will be. So just to give a basic picture of where coffee fits in global value chains. So in our context, we're focused on smallholders here in the top left, and they're going to be selling directly to a trader, which is going to facilitate some basic shelling of the coffee and drying into beans. And then that's going to be exported and then go to the export markets where, roasting happens and coffee is directed toward retail trade and coffee shops and consumers. So coffee is cultivated in more than 80 countries, although there's a handful of 5 to 10 countries that really dominate global coffee production. Over 80% is traded internationally with an export value of about US $18 billion, and retail sales over $100 billion. Coffee cultivation globally provides a primary livelihood for about 20 to 25 million farming families. And over 75% of these are the types of, smallholders we look at. So with less than 2 to 3 hectares of land. So overall, including primary producers, but also people involved in transport, processing, retail sales and other activities. It's been estimated that over 100 million people globally are involved in the coffee value chain. Women comprise over half of the global workforce. And so, within that, Indonesia is the 4th largest producer of coffee. So it's one of those major handful of producers. So what effects do we think these certification schemes would have? So the core assumption behind the certification program seems to be that farmers or producers have a knowledge gap. Okay, remember the initial intervention is really around training. So the implicit assumption seems to be that farmers have a knowledge gap. They aren't fully up to date on kind of optimal practices, especially sustainable practices. And so they need training to learn about those practices. And then they need ongoing incentives to encourage them to continue to follow those practices. That seems to be kind of the core assumption behind these interventions. So the intervention, land is really an interesting story in Semendo. There's actually maternal inheritance, so that usually the oldest daughter will inherit the land. And so a relatively low proportion of households holds a formal kind of written title to the land. So the land market is pretty illiquid here. Okay, so let me talk about what happened over the course of the study. So we worked with an international exporter that's been active in Semendo since 2012. So they started enrolling farmers into 4C. So remember, 4C was the verification standard. So they started enrolling farmers in 2012 into this kind of basic standard. And then they started upgrading farmers to Rainforest Alliance certification based on international demand for Rainforest Alliance. So this is a huge international exporter that's sourcing across, many parts of Southeast Asia and globally. So based on global demand for this kind of, Rainforest Alliance certified coffee, they started picking up, the number of farmers in Semendo that were also encouraged to join Rainforest Alliance. The company also intensified their training activities and services. So in 2014, they built a training center in Semendo so they could bring farmers together and do training in a nice facility. They had demonstration plots there where they were growing coffee according to the recommended practices. So farmers could come and see that. And in terms of export buying, so they, ultimately were trying to buy this coffee to export it. They set up a purchasing facility and started paying premiums as soon as 2012, 2013. They established a full buying center in 2014, and then that buying center was active through 2017 when they suspended the operations. So for much of 2017, it was uncertain what would happen in 2018. Would the company keep buying through their buying station? Anecdotally, when we visited Semendo in 2017, it appears that the farmers were disappointed that they couldn't sell to the buying station, but there was still hope that the buying station would keep operating in 2018. So it seems that the farmers continued to behave, in terms of following the recommended practices. They were still receiving significant support from the company, even if the company wasn't buying. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of thinking about the results. Okay, so our study launched in 2015. So we worked with the company and with local governmental and other leaders to identify farmers to sample. And I'll talk about the study designs a bit more in the next couple slides, but basically we launched this randomized control trial in 2015. We did the randomization. So we had a set of farmers who had been receiving this 4C support since as early as 2012. So we there was capacity to upgrade about 500 farmers to Rainforest Alliance certification. So we worked with the company to select those farmers by randomization. So it was quite an ethical way to do randomization in this context. The quota really kind of met nicely with the number of farmers that we wanted to recruit for the RCT. So the RCT is based on upgrading these farmers who had 4C to Rainforest Alliance. So that randomization happened in late 2015. So the company invited the farmers to join that program, and then they were certified by the first half of 2016. So we collected baseline data in 2015 across these farmer groups, and then a midline in 2017 and an end line in 2019. Okay, so first, I'll talk about both studies and then focus on the RCT. So in the RCT, we look at the effects of, again, from upgrading from 4C to RFA. So we had 59 farmer groups that were eligible for the study. again, we wanted to take about half, about 500, to upgrade to 4C. So, so we're comparing Group A, which is 30 farmer groups who had 4C from 2012 to 2015. And then from 2015, they're offered to upgrade to RFA. And then there's 29 farmer groups that are in a control, so they don't get offered Rainforest Alliance, RFA. So that's the first comparison we'll do is Group A, these 30 farmers, to the 29 in B. And then we also have a quasi-experimental analysis on the effects of 4C, comparing A plus B to a Group C of 30 farmer groups who were never connected to the exporter. So we look at outcomes across a number of categories. This kind of roughly matches to our theory of change. So if you remember, the first set of indicators was around kind of knowledge, and we're also thinking about kind of their networking and involvement in their farmer group. Then we look at on-farm practices and outcomes, so labor practices, non-labor practices, coffee production outcomes, market interactions, then time use, and then we look at these broader outcomes. So, you know, the theory of change of these schemes is thinking that there'll be impacts on farm, also off farm in terms of livelihoods, subjective well-being and perceptions and poverty. Okay, so first I'll focus on the results from the randomized control trial. Again, we are there comparing 30 farmer groups in the treatment group to 29 in the control. So what does, being offered RFA actually do? So that brought additional training and standards, including on coffee quality, environmental conservation. So, really encouraging farmers to not spray near water bodies, erosion control, ecosystem maintenance, land cover practices, also additional training on safe use of pesticides, equipment and practices, and protection of workers. So 30 farmer groups were offered to join RFA and initially agreed. Along the way, 5 of those 30 farmer groups eventually refused to join. So somewhere along the way, they had originally said yes, the training was being scheduled, and then somewhere along the way, they actually backed out, which is, their right, obviously, to join RFA. So just keep in mind that we do have some attrition. So the estimates are probably a lower bound on the kind of true effect of upgrading to RFA. So this is our main estimating equation for the econometricians in the audience. What I want to do is, since we have a panel, so we have a baseline in 2015, midline 2017, endline 2019. So I want to show the effects as of 2017 and as of 2019. So we're going to stratify the effects. This will be really easy to see in pictures. So I'll show you that in a second. So this does reduce power. So we could also pool 2017 and 2019 together. But for today's talk, I'm going to focus on separately reporting 2017 and 2019. We do standard stuff. We Winsorize the data to remove outliers. We have a couple basic controls, and we cluster standard errors at the level of treatment throughout our results. So I'm going to present the results in terms of pictures rather than tables. So it's going to look like something like this. So there'll be some outcome, and then there'll be a 0 line here. Okay. And then the treatment effect for 2017 will be in blue, and the treatment effect from 2019 will be in red. Okay. And then the lines, so these straight lines, those show the 95% confidence interval. So this is like a standard, statistical significance at 5%. So, excuse me. So here, at 5%, both effects you would say are insignificant because they cross the zero. So we can't say statistically that these point estimates are different from zero. But if you used a weaker standard of significance, say a 10% significance threshold, this effect in 2017 might be significant. So depending on how stringent you want to be with standard errors, you might see some of these that only have a small overlap at zero as, kind of pretty close to significant. And we've normalized all the effects in terms of standard deviations of the outcome variable, so they're on a standard scale. Okay, so we can compare, regardless of whether they were measured in, rupiah terms or some other way of measuring. Okay, so let's jump into the RCT results. So again, I'm going to go through those 8 categories of outcomes. So we start with knowledge outcomes and involvement in the farmer group. And this is going to be quite common across all of these results. So we find pretty muted effects. So we don't see that the farmers that are treated with RFA show huge differences in their knowledge of different prices. The time that they spent discussing coffee with other coffee farmers. There's a small bump here in the point estimate, but obviously it's quite noisy. Attendance at farmer group meetings looks like it's pretty close to significant here in 2017, and then, kind of declines back in 2019. So there's, really weak evidence here that in the early years of the intervention, the farmers are, kind of interacting a bit more with their farmer group, but then that kind of dissipates by 2019. This is kind of farm labor practices. So the first 2 are time use of the household head, who is usually going to be the main coffee farmer. We see pretty muted effects there on their time use. The third indicator is compliance with a set of labor practices. So these are labor practices that are mandated by the certification scheme. And so this would be more about how the farmer treats other people working on their farm. And again, we see pretty muted effects on that outcome. This slide is showing a whole range of non-labor farm practices. So this is things like disease and pest management, compliance with advice about banned pesticides, waste disposal practices, an index of production practices, the presence of shade trees, drying practices, and the practices of saving coffee in order to sell it at a higher price. Again, almost everything is insignificant at 5%. Just this pest management actually shows a negative effect as of 2017. Again, a tricky thing about asking these questions about practices is that, of course, if you trained a farmer, you've also made them more aware of what the ideal practice is. So they might just assess themselves more negatively relative to the ideal because they've been trained. So that's a possible kind of challenge with interpreting these kind of self-reported outcomes. So generally things are pretty flat, and the kind of the magnitude of the effect is pretty small. In terms of other measures of coffee production, this is whether coffee is affected by pests or diseases, the kilograms of total coffee produced in the year divided by the number of household members, the coffee output per hectare, total coffee expenditure, income from coffee, net profit from coffee, and coffee as a proportion of their total agricultural income. So again, we're seeing pretty muted effects. A lot of these coefficients are near zero. In terms of market interaction, if anything, the effects are almost potentially negative. So the first two categories are who you sold your coffee to directly. Are they a direct exporter? So in particular, the exporter that we're working with, or was it a local buyer? So kind of a local trader who comes to your farm gate. So they are more likely to report a local buyer as of 2019. This isn't significant at 5%, but given that the buying station had been shut down, we would have expected a shift towards local buyers and away from direct export. In terms of satisfaction with the sales process to their main buyer, both point estimates are negative, again, is significant. And quite surprisingly, the treated farmers report receiving a lower price for coffee. So, and this is actually significant at 5% and very nearly significant at 5% even as of 2019. Now we're looking kind of beyond the coffee farm. So this is self-reported time use outside coffee. So this is hours worked in the past year in agriculture, excluding coffee, total hours worked in the past year overall, and total revenue from non-coffee agriculture. So again, nothing here is significant at 5%, although, this one is probably significant at 10%. This dip in hours worked outside coffee as of 2019, and there also seems to be some activity here on revenue from non-coffee agriculture as of 2017. But again, that, dips back towards zero as of 2019. This is looking at overall household income. So we have a couple different household income measures. If anything, it looks like the impacts are potentially negative. Again, not statistically significant, but the point estimates are negative. This is a measure of total income that adjusts for net giving and receiving. That doesn't really change the story. And then this is remittances received. Those are, insignificant and basic, really tightly at zero as of 2019. Okay, the final outcome we look at, this is a couple of subjective measures of well-being. So in spite of all the other results, interestingly, when we ask farmers what they think the prospects are for coffee farming in the region over the next 5 years on a 1 to 5 scale, and the overall kind of quality of life of the household in the last production year, the treated households are actually reporting positive point estimates, especially as of 2019. Again, this isn't statistically significant at 5%, but it's probably close to significant at 10%. So there does seem to be kind of a positive uplift in subjective perceptions, even though in terms of the PPI measure of poverty, the point estimates there are also positive. So it looks like there's an increased likelihood of being in poverty that is pretty close to significant in the 2017 results. So there's kind of a real contrast here that's somewhat puzzling, that on subjectively, as of 2019, the treated farmers seem to have an uplift in perceptions, even though almost everything else looks negative or pretty muted. One other set of results that we have for the RCT is we can look at heterogeneous treatment effects by livelihood category. So we actually stratified the randomization of treatment across 4 livelihood categories: coffee-focused livelihoods, rice-focused livelihoods, durian, generally fruit production-focused livelihoods, and mixed livelihoods, to see if there's heterogeneity based on households' livelihood intensity. So in Semendo, in general, coffee is the main cash crop. To a lesser extent, other crops like fruit, and meat and other crops. While rice is really the main staple that's consumed locally. But you might think that the impacts of the program would differ. Certainly within Semendo, you'd have a variety of households, some that are very focused on coffee, some that are much less focused on coffee. And so the treatment effects might vary across those. So we did cluster analysis on our baseline data to try to kind of say which households fall into each of these four categories. And there did seem to be a fair bit of heterogeneity. So there are definitely some households that really focus on coffee, some that really focus on rice, even amongst the households that were working with the exporter. So the results would take me a long time to present in the form of tables, so I'll just kind of summarize high-level takeaways. The extent that we found heterogeneous effects, that was really most noticeable in the subgroup of farmers that was most coffee focused and most rice focused. So within the coffee focused households, we found a greater likelihood to be knowledgeable about coffee prices. Perhaps unsurprisingly, they were less likely to increase their time discussing coffee in response to the program. So that might be that they were already like pretty knowledgeable about coffee. Generally, they were more likely to decrease their intensity of work or hours worked in coffee and other work in response to the intervention. And this was the group that this group showed a really strong increase in kind of their subjective quality of life measures. So across the four groups, this seems to be the subgroup that's most driving that overall kind of subjective perception improvement, especially as of 2019. The rice focus households showed more of an improvement in labor practices. They were more likely to go the other way, so to actually increase their coffee production intensity and overall work hours. However, the PPI poverty increase here, especially in 2017, seems to particularly load on this group. The other two groups, the durian-focused and mixed livelihood groups, largely showed pretty neutral, insignificant effects, both economically and statistically. So overall takeaways from the RCT, this is the effect of taking a set of farmers that had already been working with the exporter for probably 2 to 4 years, had been receiving 4C, kind of this baseline verification and support, and then they were offered the opportunity to upgrade to RFA, and 5 of the groups eventually dropped out of that. So that's what these results are coming from. So there's some signs of an attempt to coffee operation as of 2017, but a lot of the effects tail off by 2019. Now you might say, you don't see many effects. Is that, a result of the research design? So the RCT is powered to detect impacts in the 0.2 to 0.3 standard deviation range. And, most of the coefficient estimates are between minus 0.2 and 0.2. So it's hard to say conclusively about what the impacts were in terms of statistical significance, but we can pretty strongly say that this upgrading did not have transformative impacts on most dimensions. So even if we'd had a larger sample size and more precise estimates, the coefficient estimates would still probably be in this smaller range of minus 0.2 to 0.2 standard deviations. So we can rule out really big positive effects and really big negative effects of that program for the most part. And then, of course, there was these notable negative effects that were significant or close to significant that are somewhat surprising. But by contrast, we see an uplift in perceptions as of 2019. And that seems to be driven by the coffee specialists. So there was something that seemed to be driving their optimism as of 2019, even though the rest of the results don't seem so consistent with that. Okay, how am I doing on time?
I think we have around 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay,
before the
so
Q&A.
I'll try to quickly go through some of these other results, or at least tell you about what we did. So, so again, this study had two kind of interventions running in parallel. One is the RCT that I already went through in a lot of detail. And the second was that, you know, we kind of thought, well, we have all these farmers that have been working with this exporter for a few years. Could we compare them to other farmer groups that haven't been connected to the exporter at all? So in the second set of kind of analysis, we use propensity score matching to match in farmer groups that were part of the RCT study, so kind of group A plus group B, and we compare them to this group C. So group C is 30 farmer groups that we identified that aren't connected to the exporter. So before our baseline survey, we worked with local leaders to identify lists of farmer groups, and we attempted to identify farmer groups that were as similar as possible to those in the RCT sample. So you might think, okay, that's, you know, interesting, but, you know, these group C farmers are obviously going to be a lot different to the group A plus B farmers. There must be something about their characteristics that either led them to choose not to work with the exporter if they could have, or the exporter to choose not to allow them to join the 4C program or eventually the RFA program. So there's probably a lot of selection bias to compare these two groups. So that's, you know, that's a good criticism. We think we have some hope to think that we can identify causal effects because of arbitrariness in how the farmer groups were recruited. So first of all, we think it's probably fairly ad hoc how these farmer groups were recruited. So typically the exporter would send their staff into the field and they'd spend like a day in a village and try to talk to at least all the farmer group heads to recruit them. It could have been on the day that they did recruitment that certain farmer group heads weren't available, or there were certain things going on in a farmer group that just led them not to join, even if they're otherwise pretty similar to the other farmer groups. Another source of variation is that you know, Indonesia has detailed forest maps that identify different kinds of forests, like conservation forests and protected forests. And it's illegal to grow coffee in these protected kind of forests. And so it looks like there's a lot of confusion about which you know, which areas actually fall within different forest maps. So the forest maps have changed over time. There's different government agencies with different forest maps. So it seems like there's a lot of confusion. The exporter would have wanted to be really risk averse, right? They wouldn't want to be caught certifying farmer groups that are you know, growing their coffee in kind of illegal areas. So they would have been really cautious about avoiding farmer groups that have farm plots in those protected areas, whereas those farmer groups that might be growing in an area that seems like it might be protected might still be very similar to other farmer groups that don't happen to fall into those areas based on these maps. So it seems at least plausible that there might be some arbitrary sources of variation that drive whether a farmer group ended up working with the exporter or not. So we verify that, you know, using propensity score matching to match groups, farmers across groups A plus B to group C. And then we conduct a differences analysis in our panel data to identify the ongoing impact of 4C on A plus B compared to C, taking 2015 as a baseline. So we can go through the same set of outcomes that I went through before. We see a lot more significant effects here. Again, our sample size goes up a lot because we're not just comparing A to B, we're adding this third group, C. And so we see a lot of effects. So increased, 4C farmers are more likely to attend their farmer group meetings. Sorry, I should go in order here. We see a negative effect as of 2019 on their knowledge of different prices and on time spent discussing coffee. But we see, if anything, positive effects on group attendance. So this might just be, a tapering of, engagement with the farm, with discussing coffee as we get later and later in the program. We see a negative effect on hours spent on coffee farming as of 2017. Positive effects on self-reported compliance with pesticide practices, with conservation practices, self-reported negative effects on compliance with drying practices and storing coffee to sell it at a higher price later. We see a lower likelihood of their coffee being affected by pests or diseases, greater expenditure on coffee as of 2017. Interestingly, we see higher reported net profits from coffee in both 2017 and 2019, and those magnitudes are pretty significant. And even then, coffee declines as a proportion of agricultural income. So it looks like overall agricultural income is going up even more. As of 2017, again, this is consistent with the buying station shutting down. So the main buyer is less likely to be a direct exporter, more likely to be a local buyer. Again, we see this decline in the average price received for coffee. So this seems to be an effect across the farmers working with the exporter, that they're just reporting receiving a lower price. In terms of time use, we really see a lot of declines, if anything, in terms of time use, so work hours spent outside coffee, however you measure it, and that leads to this reduction. On the livelihood front, in terms of total household net income, we're also seeing reductions as of 2017 and really zero effects as of 2019. And then on those subjective perceptions, we're actually seeing a lot less action here than we saw in the RCT. So the only real action is a negative effect on perceptions for coffee farming in the region over the next 5 years as of 2017. And as of 2019, things go pretty much back to zero on the perceptions and poverty front. Okay, so just concluding overall, and glad to discuss further. Sustainability verification and certification programs are very important in global coffee value chains. However, there's a need for more rigorous impacts on the rigorous evidence on the impacts of these programs. That's particularly the case for smallholder production. So a lot of the kind of more rigorous research using panel data tends to be on more specialty coffee production and estate coffee production in Central and South America, rather than the kind of smallholder production that's tends to be for Robusta coffee in regions of Indonesia. And I think it's really important to evaluate these programs in the smallholder context because coffee is typically a component of a more complex livelihood strategy. So farmers are growing coffee as a cash crop. They might also be, growing rice. They might also be, farming fish, growing durian. They might be, taking off-farm work opportunities locally or further away. There's a lot of different things that the household head will be doing throughout the year, and also their family members will be doing to earn income and produce food. So it's really important to think about how these programs that are very kind of coffee centric interact with these broader livelihoods. So I'd say overall we find muted and highly mixed impacts of these programs across a range of outcomes. We can debate how big the effects are, but certainly we don't see the program generating transformational effects on the coffee farm. If anything, a lot of our results show a moderation of investment in coffee in terms of time use and other dimensions. So we fail to kind of find some of the overall development impacts that these programs purport to provide. Okay, I'll stop there. And hopefully that leaves time to have discussion and questions, et cetera. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you so much, Russell, for the clear presentation. I think it's very complex and rigorous research that you did here. Now we can move on to the Q&A session. I think we are also joined by Professor Usman Arifin here. They will join us in the discussion. As mentioned by Mbak Lydia on the chat box, if you have any question or any point you would like to discuss, please leave a comment on the Q&A box or raise your hand so our team can unmute you to deliver the question. For now, we already have a few questions on the Q&A box. The first question here is from Pak Heru from Kehulu Coffee. He has two questions. The first one is, I will read the question for the audience in the YouTube as well. So the first question is, in the study final report, the research concludes that coffee management practices have yield have not improved. If I recall correctly, the midline seminar of this research with ICIL in 2018 indicated that time spent on farm decreases for those who receive trainings. Can we draw causal relationship between the former and the latter? And then you also have a follow-up question. Second question is, in training design, many implementers failed to internalize the nature of farmers' hesitancy to join classroom session. What are the methods of training delivery in 4C and rainforest audience? Okay, maybe Russell or Musdan Arifin would like to answer these questions.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. Great memory to think back to our midline report. Yeah, so we're continuing to see that pattern of if anything, time decrease at midline, and certainly a lack of time increase. We can't necessarily draw a causal relationship between different outcomes. So we could say that, we see a time decrease, we see, coffee management practices and yields haven't improved. So those seem correlated, but we can't conclusively say that one is causing another because they're both a function of the program. So we can say that those are related, but it certainly would seem plausible that the time decrease would be associated with yield decreases. But we haven't done mediation analysis, and our design technically, doesn't allow us to say conclusively that one is causing the other. They could both be, caused by a third factor, for example. One thing, yeah, so this idea, is that farmers might fail to join the training session. So that's a really interesting point. We're actually doing some additional analysis where we're trying to use weather data as a source. Them won't attend. So the program was meant to be kind of a, train the trainer
Recording in progress
program where they were trying to really invest in the farmer group head, and then
recording in progress
time and energy so that farmers might focus more on other resources.
Communicate clearly. So the data was analyzed at the individual farmers level. So if you look at the N in the regressions, it's hundreds or 2,000 or 3,000 farmers. We just cluster the standard errors at the level of the farmer group. So we allow for the fact that there might be correlation within the farmer group in outcomes, and so we need to correct our standard errors for that, which does make it less likely that we'll find a significant effect. But that's kind of the correct way to do it when you have a impact evaluation, cluster your standard errors at the level of treatment. So since in both the RCT
recording
and
stopped.
The other study, the treatment is allocated at farmer level, randomized at farmer level, we need to cluster standard errors at farmer level, but that's a standard error correction that we're doing after running the regression at farmer level or household level. And then the other question,
Qualitative on qualitative data collection.
Yeah, there was a massive amount of qualitative research done. I should have probably said more about that at the beginning. So this was, these quantitative studies were part of a broader research agenda that involved a lot of qualitative research also that was led by Jeff Nielsen and other colleagues. So there was a lot of work done, and I did some qualitative work too, that just kind of talking to farmers, but there was like systematic qualitative work done by people who are specialists in qualitative research to try to understand this. One big lesson from the qualitative research was that these programs seem to drive more kind of social network connections, more interaction between farmers. That was something that came across probably more strongly in the qualitative results than the quantitative results. There also seemed to be some confusion about these programs and sometimes lack of awareness at the individual farmer level. So that might reflect the fact that there was a lot of variation within farmer groups in terms of some farmers that were might have been really engaged with the training opportunities and some that were more passive or weren't even attending the training activities. In terms of complaints about intensity and frequency, honestly, I don't remember what the finding was there off the top of my head. I'd encourage you to look at some of the other reports that have been put together that kind of integrate the quantitative and qualitative findings, and some of the papers that have come out of the qualitative research. Those have basically all been published, so they're out there in the public domain.
Okay, so the points that you presented before are highlighting the just the quantitative aspect of the study, right? Okay. Next, we also have a question from Pak Petra Mahi. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. He asked, does women's land ownership in this area transfer to their membership of the farmers group in your study? And could you please elaborate on any findings in relation to the differences between male and female coffee farmers and their responses to the certification schemes? So would like to learn more about the gender aspect of this study, I guess.
Yeah. Does women's land ownership in this area transfer to their membership of the farmer groups? So my understanding, maybe Bustinol could also chip in on this, is that often women would be understood to be the landowner, but then the farmland would be kind of managed within the household, and so the woman's like male partner might be the one who's taking more of a lead on coffee farming. So yeah, women and men can be members of farmer groups, but in practice, it seems that the lead farmers were overwhelmingly male. And so it's hard to do subgroup analysis comparing male to female, because the female kind of lead farmer group would be really small in our sample, unfortunately. So yeah, I wish I could say more, but I can't say more than that off the top of my head. So.
Can I add something?
Oh yeah.
Thank you, Petra, for the question. We don't do differentiate that in the analysis. The majority, as Russell mentioned, the majority of our samples are male. Okay, that we interview male more. I think female very few. So we don't really segregate that. Whether any impact, well, could be, but we cannot answer very well, of course, at this time. But the decision sometimes for the thing that relates into household economics, probably female can have some influence, but really we don't do segregation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Pak Busano, for the clarification. Okay. Oh yeah, Mbak Lydia, you raised your hand.
Thanks, Mbak Nabila. I have a question that I wanted to ask when I first saw this presentation presented. What were the findings in, I guess, other similar studies on the effect of certification? Is it an anomaly that results or studies show that there is mixed result or even negative or insignificant result in terms of improvement of welfare? A second, maybe part of the certification, as I understand it, is the aim of certification is to provide wider benefits, so external to the farmers themselves. So these are, I guess, what we sometimes call positive externalities, meaning that farmers actually contribute to improved environmental outcomes. Is this something that the study or the training try to try to inform the farmers, in which case I think it's a bit puzzling for me that given negative or mixed outcomes, farmers still want to continue their, I guess, overall positive about the program and so on. So could this be something more related to their knowledge that they are benefiting the society and so on? So it's not observed through the either the training or the results. Thank you.
Oh yeah, please, Russell or Pak Busano, if you want to answer the question.
Yeah, I'd say there's a lot of really mixed results in the literature. I guess two things. One, I wouldn't say that this is inconsistent. There's a lot of mixed results in the literature. I would say a lot of the literature, not all of it necessarily measures as many things comprehensively as we do. A lot of the other literature is based on maybe shorter surveys. So sometimes it doesn't, it might look at the coffee impacts and there the impacts could be mixed. I mean, I would say that our price decline is surprising. I would say that, across a lot of other literature, you generally see a price increase for the participants. But in terms of these kind of new, mixed impacts on profitability and income from coffee, there's a number of other studies that find that. What was I going to say? I think like the fact, there's some indication that farmers are decreasing time use at times and maybe, shifting into other activities or things like that. I think that's a bit, less of the story in other literatures, in other literature. So I think that's maybe a bit more unique, but yeah, the existing literature is quite mixed. Yeah. What do you think, Bustino?
Yeah, actually, we contribute to something else, if you want to say that. We do not what you call support or against the finding or the literature that concludes that certification does not have impact or does have impact. So we contribute to improvement of the analysis by measuring the intervention in the theory of change, as Russell mentioned. So it's not only the output of the certification itself, but the process, I think, is more interesting. As you know, in the result, in the beginning, farmers are really, really interested, especially after getting training, all the way coming to the hall and enjoying something new, something like that. Then after sometimes, when farmers, I think, cannot meet the expectation, very good. When the outcome does not meet the expectation, probably this starts skepticism. So this kind of thing. So we look like we in the policy implication, yes, we can contribute something, but probably the improvement on the way of intervention strategies. We haven't touched anything about extension, for example. So this thing will hopefully our contribution in the study. Thank you.
And then there was also the question on kind of broader externalities. Like Lydia, I'm not sure if I understood the question exactly, but it was kind of like, there kind of a broader awareness of environmentalism and that kind of stuff. Yeah, we didn't measure that, and that would be hard to say if that had. I would be surprised if we found that effect, given that we're finding on other dimensions. Maybe there's some awareness raising, but there'd be a lot of confounding trends. I mean, there's lots of discussions in Indonesia about forest management and fires and other things. So it's hard to say that this program would be driving that. Maybe a little bit on the margin, but yeah, we're not well placed to measure that. So.
Okay. Yeah, we still have some time for this Q&A session. If any of the audience want to ask question, maybe in Bahasa Indonesia, you can put it in the Q&A box or maybe raise your hand, so you can deliver the question directly. Yeah, I think Lydia's question earlier is very interesting about why the farmers would stay in the program even despite the negative impacts. Maybe if perhaps they have this awareness of external positivities, so for the reason to stay in the program. Okay, so do we have any other question? Okay, Pak Heru has raised his hand. Maybe. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mbak Nabila. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay. Good morning, Pak Bustano and Russell. A very extensive work. I don't think anybody in the coffee sector in Indonesia has done something at this level. So thank you and congratulations for this completion of the work. I do believe there's a lot more work to be explored, as Pak Bustano mentioned, particularly on the intervention and the delivery side of the intervention itself. But I'm curious about the incentive structure, for instance, because I know we cannot answer this at the moment, but the price difference and price incentive for Robusta is very small, compared to the Arabica prices, if you want to compare. And in the recent years, some part of Semendo farmers actually starting to grow Arabica coffee to capture the higher, price, of the commodity. Could that also explain, the potential lack of, motivation to actually invest in more time and energy to improve the yields and quality of the farming? And maybe in another sense, could that price also explain why some of the farmers decided to grow Arabica instead of Robusta in some of the areas?
Do you want to take that, Bustano? I feel like you're the expert more than me.
Thank you, Pak Heru. The question is quite broad. Sorry. Yes, we have a lot of things to do in terms of price incentive and so on. Like today, the price of Arabica is way very high, similar to the one during the food crisis in 2008. Do you think the government have good response? Maybe not necessarily, because if you want to encourage farmers to switch to Arabica, probably the place are very limited. Okay, now we're talking about Robusta. Semendo is almost 100% Robusta in mostly southern Sumatra. You're right. The price incentive, actually, if you come up, if you have the policy that create improvement in quality, the way of harvest methods, and anything, that probably will improve the price incentive, because we cannot just simply ask the buyers to buy coffee products higher, no, because improvement in quality, improvement in the products, what do you call, grading and thing, and post harvest and so on, probably we should contribute. But I think other studies will do that instead of this study. I have some other studies, of course, and that relates to this kind of incentive. Actually, in our qualitative studies, there are some indications of that, as I mentioned earlier by Russell. Thank you.
One other trivia I would say on price is, I mentioned that the buying station shut down in 2017, and then, fully as of 2018. That happened because the Robusta, the cost to export from Indonesia or from Semendo was getting too high. So it wasn't economical for the exporter to buy Robusta from Semendo and then ship it to, Bandar Lampung, and then, ship it out and whatever the margin. So, whether it was domestic demand in Indonesia or, global demand, or, the lack of relative productivity of farmers in Semendo relative to other parts of the world. It was that, the Robusta coffee was getting too costly the exporter to source, not that, somehow they were, disappointed with the farmers or something like that. It was really a cost story there. So.
Okay.
Thank you both for the answer.
Okay. Thank you, Paheru, for the question, and for the topic of discussion. I think we still have 5 minutes. Do we have any other question, maybe from the audience? If not, if we don't have any other question, maybe we can invite Russell for the closing comments.
Just yeah, thanks for everyone for coming. It's great to be presenting this work. It's been a long journey and lots of JPAL staff. I think it's like for the last 6 years in JPAL, like there's so many people that have worked on the study, and so it's kind of a connection point between a lot of different JPAL staff and so many others that have worked on it. So really grateful to all our partners, and really excited to put this piece alongside a lot of other great work that Bustanul and Jeff and many other colleagues have done on this research agenda, and more broadly on understanding this industry. It's ever evolving. There's more and more direct certification, more and more corporations moving away from the third-party schemes and going in-house. You had the merger between Rainforest Alliance and UTS. There was a real people were complaining around the world that they were kind of having to double certify. They'd have to get Rainforest Alliance and UTS and maybe 4C. So there was a consolidation there in that kind of third-party sector. So it's an ever-evolving dynamic sector. And I think, for researchers and students thinking about research topics, there's lots of great stuff to do. Lots of exciting remote sensing data to look at, the impacts on forest cover and other things that could be done using variation in the rollout of these programs. So, as Bustanul said, I think there's a lot more to do. And thanks for listening to our small piece of the contribution.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Russell and Pak Bustanul, for sharing your research. It has been a pleasure to learn about this very extensive project. I think we can end the presentation and the Q&A session. And for this, maybe I pass to Mbak Lydia again to close the agenda. Mbak Lydia, thank you for the time.